Bonjour, bonjour, bienvenue. Merci beaucoup de votre présence. On va pouvoir commencer donc cette masterclass consacrée à l'œuvre d'Anand Patwardhan. Je vais donc dire quelques mots à son sujet, au sujet de Christophe Jaffrelot, qui nous fait le plaisir d'être là. Anand Patwardhan, comme vous savez sans doute, est venu au monde la même année que la Constitution indienne, et peut-être d'une certaine façon son œuvre s'en trouve-t-elle comme traversée par le souffle de l'histoire collective. Et c'est une œuvre qui nous décrit une nation comme personne, à ma connaissance en tout cas, ne nous l'avait encore montré, c'est-à-dire observer du point de vue des conflits, des lignes de fracture, parfois falsificatrices, des situations les plus injustes et parfois aussi les plus violentes, et dont les films d'Anand nous rappellent souvent ou nous aident à comprendre la profonde absurdité. C'est une œuvre qui est entièrement conçue du point de vue des exploités, des parties les plus faibles, les plus déshéritées d'une société, et elle s'est donnée pour fonction, pour tâche de décrire à la fois les origines et les enjeux des situations dont elle s'empare, donc celle des femmes, celle des intouchables, entre guillemets, celle de certaines communautés stigmatisées. Et dans la plupart de ces films, Anand, avec parfois un très grand courage, s'efforce de recueillir la parole de toutes les parties en présence, mais sans jamais, évidemment, abandonner quoi que ce soit de son point de vue, de sa propre position, qui du coup analyse la situation avec une très grande clarté et donc une extraordinaire énergie à la fois d'activiste mais aussi de pédagogue. Donc je remercie infiniment Anand en amont de cette séance, à la fois pour son œuvre magistrale et pour sa présence parmi nous. Pour nous aider à mieux comprendre et mettre en valeur et en contexte les enjeux des films d'Anand, nous allons bénéficier de l'expertise de Christophe Jaffrelot, qui est professeur, spécialiste de l'histoire de la vie du Sud, et que je remercie infiniment pour sa disponibilité. Christophe Jaffrelot est directeur de recherche au CNRS, enseignant à Sciences Po, mais il enseigne aussi désormais au King's College, à Preston, dans tous les endroits prestigieux du monde, et donc on a une chance tout à fait extraordinaire de l'avoir aujourd'hui avec nous à Paris. Alors je voudrais citer parmi ces innombrables publications 3 ouvrages. En 1998, La démocratie en Inde, sous-titré Religion, caste et politique. Le plus récent, dont le titre pourrait être aussi un commentaire du travail d'Anand, Inde, l'envers de la puissance, et sous-titré Inégalité et révolte, paru chez Fayard, presse du CNRS en 2012. Et puis il a publié aussi en anglais Religion, Caste and Politics in India, donc au Columbia University Press en 2010-2011. Donc pour cette masterclass, Anand a préparé une série d'extraits de ses films, organisés chronologiquement, et dont certains ne sont pas montrés au cours de cet hommage. Et donc pendant environ 1 heure, 1h30, il va nous les commenter en compagnie de Christophe. Vous pouvez bien sûr intervenir, si vous le souhaitez, au cours de ces commentaires. Et puis ensuite, nous disposerons donc enfin d'une grande plage de temps pour pouvoir échanger avec lui, lui poser toutes les questions que son œuvre soulève, à la fois sur l'Inde, sur son histoire, mais aussi sur ses choix cinématographiques, sur sa vision de l'humanité, puisque au-delà évidemment des questions locales, ce que son œuvre évidemment nous décrit et nous transmet, ce sont aussi des comportements humains qui nous touchent d'où que nous les voyions. Je voudrais enfin signaler dans la salle la présence de Kwodo et Shun et de Angelica Sagar, donc de l'Autorite Group. Je ne les vois pas, où est-ce qu'ils sont? Assis. Ah oui. Et c'est très important pour nous puisqu'ils connaissent aussi bien l'œuvre d'Anand que la personne. Et donc, nous serons évidemment très attentifs et très heureux de recueillir à la fois leurs remarques, leurs commentaires et leurs compléments d'information sur cette œuvre qui leur importe et dont ils sont, je crois, de grands admirateurs. Donc, je laisse la parole à Anand, à moins que Christophe veuille introduire aussi son point de vue sur l'œuvre.
Because before you start, that may be, I think, appropriate. Just to say that for the social scientists working on India, the work of Anand Patwardhan is invaluable. And I was very pleased to see many of my students coming and sometimes even from India and discovering Anand's work in Paris, which is a real success. I think for two reasons, it's that invaluable. First of all, indeed, it's the direct access to the history of the last 30, 40 years. And secondly, first-hand material. For the social scientists that we are, sometimes you can't have access to these kind of sources. And I would say that this is a history of India that has the quality of mixing events and long-term trends. Events, the emergency, there is no book on the emergency. The film Anand made in 1978, just after the emergency, is a source of an event that is, of course, invaluable. And then trends, Dalit politics, Hindu fundamentalism, these are long-term trends that, unfortunately, for some of them, we can understand better with these documentaries. And even some trends, of course, mix. So Anand selects the events which are the best entry points into these trends. The Ayodhya movement, and you are immediately immersed in the internationalist movement. Two last quick words. This is an history from below. This is the history that is not written by people who cannot write their history, because sometimes they just don't know how to read and write. So we have their voice, and when a woman says the way she has been called chamar in her Kiev Dalit caste, she would have never been able to write it because she can't write it. So it's an history from below, and it's an history that is from below, but with always, in each of Anand's film, I think, the voice of the oppressor as well. So you will see, for instance, in Bombay or city, the upper middle class people talking about the Dalit in the most derogatory way. And I find it very useful to understand the oppression, not only by seeing the oppressed, but by listening to the oppressor. And sometimes in a very candid way, explaining that, yes, hierarchy should stand and oppression is somewhat taken for granted. I think it's another quality of this work. And thank you for being with us for this masterclass that will even, I'm sure, enlighten many more people.
Merci, Christophe. Anand, I'm sure you don't like compliments, so sorry. But now this is your words.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, what you described when you introduced my work was always that I'm making films about the other, because I'm making films about people who are not as privileged as I am in my country. That's true, of course. But at the same time, these films are also about me. They may not be about me in the most obvious sense, in the sense that I think I have only one film where I speak in the first person, and there was a reason for that. But even though I'm not there, sometimes I'm not there visibly, I am always actually there, and the films are very subjective. They come from my understanding of the world. And in a sense, we are all implicated in whatever happens. So even when the films describe the lives of people who are not privileged, who have faced injustice, I'm already implicated as somebody belonging to the class that did this, that has benefited from this. Benefited in a stupid sense, not benefited in the long-term sense. Okay, so some of you have been watching my films in Cinema in the last few days, so you'll have to forgive me for repeating myself, because when I introduce these clips, I might be using the same words that I used when I introduced the films the first time. So, but I'll do it as quickly as possible, leaving more time for discussion. I've organized the material more or less chronologically. I think in the last 40 years I've made about 15 films, including 4 very short films, 5-minute films, and the rest were longer format. Some of them are very long format, in the sense like more than feature length. So we'll begin. The first film I want to start with is actually not my very first film, because the very first film I made when I had a scholarship and I came to America in 1970, it was right in the middle of the Vietnam War, and my university was part of the anti-war movement, and I got caught up in that, and my very first footage was filming anti-war protests. And then while I was in America, this was the time when Bangladesh had not yet been formed. It was 1971, and there were refugees coming from East Pakistan into India, and we were trying to raise money for the refugees. So in my university, we organized a fast and asked people not to eat for a day. And I made a very short film, borrowing equipment in my university, about whether people were eating that day or not. So this was a film called Business as Usual. I don't have a clip of that here. So we start with, when I came back to India in 1972, worked in a village project for a few years as a volunteer. And by 1974, I joined a people's movement in Bihar, in the state of Bihar. And my job there was to take photographs of police atrocities, but I ended up borrowing Super 8 camera and then later a 16mm camera, and made a film called which later got called Waves of Revolution. This film actually went underground in 1975 when a state of emergency was declared in India, and the film had to be smuggled abroad in bits and pieces and then reassembled. Then after emergency in 1977, when they has easy access to the lights. Yeah, okay, looks like we have. Sometimes I might just do 1 or 2 clips together so that we don't waste a lot of time stopping and starting. But
just a word, when you see the mobilization against corruption, of course, you see, I would say, badly placed in the comparison with the Anazari movement that has taken place over the last couple of years. But we may return to that in the discussion to see whether history is repeating itself in India or not.
In some ways, yes, in retrospect, one of the things that began to happen in non-violent anti-corruption movement was that it got infiltrated by the right-wing elements. In those days, the Hindutva, the RSS for instance, the RSS was the party, the extreme right-wing Hindu party that was largely responsible for Mahatma Gandhi's assassination. And after Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, this party became completely, party meaning it was an organization, became completely unpopular. They were in fact banned for a few years, and then the ban was lifted. And the movement, their movement had gone underground, but they kept organizing secretly and they kept increasing in power. It was 1974 when this movement that I was part of, generally a non-violent socialist attempt to make India more democratic and more transparent, because they got infiltrated by the right wing and because the leadership was not fully cognizant about what that meant. When the emergency ended, this right-wing element actually, together with, in a coalition with many others, came to power in India in 1977. And meaning it was, they were not fully in power, they were part of an alliance. But they got rehabilitated in a sense from the time when they were unpopular for having killed Gandhi to a point where they had become more legitimate. The next film is Prisoners of Conscience, and this was a film that was begun during the emergency. I actually spent a lot of my time abroad during the emergency. I was able to escape in a sense because I got a teaching assistantship in a university in Canada. And I then put together these pieces that I had smuggled out of the earlier film and was able to show that to raise consciousness against the emergency from outside the country. So at this moment I also started making a film about the emergency because we didn't know how long this emergency, this dictatorship would last. In 1977, through an election, the dictatorship came to an end and I came back to India, only to find that many political prisoners whom the movement had promised to release once they came back, once they actually overthrew the dictatorship, when they came to power, there was a selective release of prisoners. The people who were not released were those who were accused of having violent ideologies. So Maoists, people from the left, people from the northeast who were fighting for their separate identity. So I continued to make a film about political prisoners. And this is that film. This was completed in 1978. Again, still black and white, but slightly better equipment than the first film. Emergency ended in 78, and there was a time where democratic rights were, there were many organizations fighting for democratic rights after the experience of the emergency. So it was a good time for human rights activists, for civil liberties people, and that was the context in which this film could be made and shown in India through activist organizations. These are all films, right up to 1995, everything that I was shooting was in 16mm. So the first two were black and white films, but after I think it was 79, I went back to Canada to finish my degree, which I had left halfway to come back when the emergency ended in India. And when I was in Canada doing my master's, I came across Indian farm workers, agricultural labor, that was working in British Columbia, in the western part of Canada. And they had seen some of these two films of mine, as they were of Indian origin, and they asked if I could do something about their condition and their fight. I got together with a Canadian filmmaker, actually probably hadn't made many films before we did this together, and he was able to film the white farmers that wouldn't have talked to me, and I filmed the workers, and we collaborated and completed this film in '81. Farm workers in Canada at that time were not allowed to organize. I mean, they were not allowed to form a union because for some reason it was considered that because they're growing produce, this was essential for everyone to eat and they couldn't have the danger of strikes. But I had actually worked with a farm workers union in America when I was a student. At the end of my studies, I spent 6 months with Cesar Chavez in California, helping to organize the United Farm Workers Movement union. And when I started working with the people of Indian origin in Canada, we actually invited Chavez to come to Canada and show his solidarity with the Canadian Farm Workers Union. So this film actually documented the birth of Canada's first Farm Workers Union. So anyway, that's probably one of the rare films that I made that have a happy ending, because the union did get formed towards the end of the filming. And it was Canada's first farm workers union, and it still survives to this day, at a time when unions are under attack everywhere in the world. So I came back to India after getting my master's, and in 1982, when I returned to India, I was faced with the fact that my city was in the middle of a demolition campaign. They were basically, it was a time when, in the early 80s is when the liberalization process had begun in earnest in India. Previous to this point, India was a kind of a mixed economy with socialist ideas as well as capitalist ones. A lot of public enterprise along with private enterprise, and a lot of government controls over things. But by the 80s, this under pressure from the IMF or the World Bank, the whole economic pattern was beginning to change. One of the consequences was that the attacks on the poor increased. And you see that in Bombay, because Bombay was at this point now trying to make the city attractive for foreign investment and foreign capital, which meant that they wanted to remove people who lived in slums and the visible signs of poverty they didn't want people to see. And so the people who lived on the footpaths in the most vulnerable sections of society, their homes were being demolished. This film was made at that time. Okay, so I don't know if we want to talk about this some more or we'll move on, but basically...
Yes, I would be happy, of course, because you choose so well this very important except that for me should be screened to any student of cinema at the beginning of a class, and of course that must be seen by any committed filmmaker. I mean, the ethics of a filmmaker that begins here with this question of this wonderful person. You record us, you take our picture of us, but what can you do for us? So, and also one of the characteristics of your work is that very often in your film there is a sequence where with a kind of agitprop theater, theater of the streets, very pedagogical for the crowds. So, of course, the question is what cinema is useful for. What are the functions of cinema for you?
Yeah, well, I think that the question that the woman I was filming there asked me, and these were the early days when we started filming. I'd actually been taking photographs first to help the People's Union for Civil Liberties fight a court case against these demolitions. And so, in my own conscience, I was doing something that was going to be useful, but that was not visible to the people who saw me for the first time with the camera. But at the same, so while it felt awful at the time I was filming it, I thought it was important because it's a question that all of us filmmakers who make films about other people's misery and other people's the injustices have to ask ourselves at every moment whether the film that we're making or whatever documentation that we're doing is going to be of use to the people that we are filming. Because if I can't answer that question honestly to myself, then I don't have the right to be there. At least I don't have the right to intervene in those moments, which are moments of terrible crisis or private moments even. So I think it's basically a question that is put to the filmmaker, but it's also a question is the audience is confronted with, that you're watching all this, and what difference will that make?
Well, just on this agitprop thing, there is a long tradition in India of conscientization via theatre, and Dalit theatre is one of the things you see repeatedly. For those who can't read and have no time to go to places where you would have political mind unfolding itself, troops come and somewhat do the same thing as you do, but the theatrical way. So you can relate that to a long tradition. The only thing I would like to add on the Bombay OCT film is that, of course, I'm sure in this series of clips we will not hear the voice of the dominant, because precisely they are not there.
These are only 2 minutes or
exactly.
3 minute clips. Yeah.
I know, and that's why I would like to bring that back in. The fascinating interview of the municipal commissioner or collector or whatever is there. And for those who have seen the film, and for those who have not seen the film, they must see the film. Also for this scene, so the blatant way justifying this. They have to go back to their village. We don't care for them. We will not let them stay. We will not let. And this is really a very important dimension of Anand Patwardhan's film. We do not have only the voice of the oppressed, but the justification of the oppression.
And they hate too.
And the hate.
And the styles.
The hatred.
Yeah, that's so surprising.
Yeah, I don't know how you let them. I don't know you can get this kind of, I would say, candid acknowledgement of social hierarchy, because it's so cruel. It's so cruel that people would feel, I would say, inhibited, but they don't.
Can I just make a point as well?
Yeah.
I don't know if this is working.
It's working.
Is it? Well, I'm always interested in how the implication. So it's for me, it's not necessarily that shocking to see upper class Indians talking like this about lower caste Indians. Upper caste, that caste and class are intertwined. So I think in the West as well, we can see similar situations, increasingly so happening in Europe, the division between the rich and the poor. But I want to just ask about this implication in relation to what you were saying earlier, Anand, about your role in exploring the politics of oppression in India. And specifically in the sense of having come out of this history of Jay Prakash Narayan, other members of your family, and people from this particular movement just post Gandhi, where there seemed to me to be a real sense of an ethical position taken in relation to the oppressed, whereby there was a sense of responsibility that was taken by people who were supposedly on the left within, let's say, to be very general, the upper class. And I would like to know now, because that's rare, I think, still in India. I mean, now I'm not so sure how much work is being done, but I would just like you to maybe consider and compare the relationship that you see activists having now, let's say, to people in India who are oppressed.
I don't think that's changed. I mean, activists come from all different classes and castes. I mean, activists by definition, are people who may have at least attempted to change the baggage that they were born with. And that's what makes them decide to do political work. And they're not always successful, because even if they come from the upper caste, even if they're well-meaning, there are sometimes limitations on what they can do and their understanding of the world. I think I'm not any different from that. I think we'll talk about those kind of things a little later as we see more. But as far as the, for instance, the agit-prop element, the theatre element that you talked about, it's basically, again, this is not theatre that I put together. I'm documenting what there already is. And as a documentary filmmaker, I look for the things that will tell my story as well as possible. And those theatrical moments are wonderful because they encapsulate so much, because there are other people who have already thought this out and thought their interventions out. And when I come across them, of course I will show them, especially when they're great, when they're really wonderful performers and their politics comes through so clearly. So the agit-prop elements in my film are actually the documentation of other people's agit-prop. Yeah.
And the songs as well.
And the songs, yeah.
I wanted to ask a question about song as well. So in Ways of Revolution, we hear a chant, between like demonstrators are chanting, like we hear a female voice, then we hear people responding.
It's a song being sung from stage, which I then intercut later on. Yes.
Okay, and then in Prisoners of Conscience, we hear this a prisoner's song, a kind of a lament, which is simultaneously a kind of a cry of anger. And then even in Time to Rise, you cut from the radio pop music. So I think maybe this is something that is a continual thread throughout your work, this question of
music.
Yeah, musicality and collectivity and a certain kind of musical subject, like a certain kind of group subject who's implied by different forms of music. The music is simultaneously, it's a kind of collective expression which can gather people inside of the time of this particular music. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about this question of music as another character. So there's the character there are the people that you see on the screen, and then there's the musical character, who sometimes is not on the screen at all, but is somehow both on the screen and not on the screen. Somehow belongs to the group that you're seeing, but it also exists as this other group. So I wonder if you could talk just about this, about the subject of the musical, like who sings.
Yeah, what I'll do is I will, as I started to figure out my form, or I never actually sat down to figure out my form. I just did it. But if you look at most of my films, you'll rarely hear any background music. The music is usually identified. I mean, in the sense that you know where the music is coming from. You can see the characters who are in the film actually singing or performing, and very rarely do I use off-camera music after, either before or after I've identified where it's coming from. So you can hear, you might begin with the song and then continue with other visuals, or you might have other visuals and then you end up seeing where the song is coming from. So by and large, I've never used music or effects to enhance mood. To either, there are no violins when somebody dies and any of that stuff. So it's always the music that is locatable within the people that I'm filming. I do use music a lot. Again, whenever I talk like this, it sounds like I've decided these things, but that's not the way it happens. We are actually analyzing what has already happened on film. So one thing is that I always want to use narration or a script as little as possible. Sometimes I've actually managed to eliminate the narration altogether. Like in Bombay City, there is the film doesn't tell you anything, meaning the filmmaker doesn't tell you anything through words. But I do use a song throughout that film, which acts as my commentary, because I don't need to write the commentary because I already came across a song that says what I wanted to say. And so I intercut that song at key moments instead of having a narration saying, now we're watching this. So very often the music is carrying the voice, carrying the direction that I want the film to move in. It may not be music that I always agree with or like. Sometimes the music comes from the other side as well, but it's there.
Like a symptom.
Yeah.
But also you are a singer.
Oh, I'm a bathroom singer.
You sing during protestations.
Oh yeah. I mean, when we're
protest song.
Yeah, those things we do. I mean, and you don't have to be good to do that. But it helps if you are. Yeah.
Did you bring your guitar?
No.
No much.
I don't. Yeah, guitar is certainly my weakest link. Oh, sorry. I forgot to introduce this film. This is now India in the mid-80s, and as I said, 80s saw the dawn of liberalization and changing of the economic basis of the country. But it also saw the rise of religious fundamentalism. This rise of religious fundamentalism certainly you could see in India in the 80s, but you can see it in many parts of the world. For one reason or the other, there was a rise. There were two things happening. There was the socialist experiment was seen to have failed. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed. Countries like Yugoslavia broke up into its constituent parts and ethnicities. Ethnic war began, religious war began. In Afghanistan, the Americans brought in Islamic fundamentalism to counter communists. They funded the fundamentalists in Pakistan. They didn't just fund them, they actually created them. Because there is footage of Brzezinski in Pakistan telling in camps saying that jihad is your duty to fight the communists. So there's very concrete evidence of the creation of this Islamic jihadi idea. Bin Laden was brought in, planted, etc. So you can imagine that with this rise of Islamic fundamentalism on the borders of India, it would have an effect. And in India also, Hindu fundamentalism began to rise. It's not that it didn't exist, it obviously existed, but there is a corresponding rise. There also is the rise of Sikh fundamentalism in the form of a Sikh separatist movement in the 80s. And this can also be linked to international pressures because at one point in time, Indira Gandhi's government was seen as being pro-Soviet in the Cold War period, and destabilizing that government was important to those forces that wanted to fight the pro-Soviet influence. If you remember in the Bangladesh war, India sided with the Bangladeshi liberation movement. America sided with those who wanted Pakistan to continue its occupation of Bangladesh. And America even brought in the 7th Fleet to try and ensure that Bangladesh was not born. Anyway, in this context, in Punjab, the Sikh separatist movement began to grow. It was also encouraged for local reasons. The local Congress government wanted to divide and rule in Punjab, and they started supporting one section of Sikh fundamentalists until it got out of hand. And finally, Indira Gandhi attacked the Golden Temple, the holiest shrine of the Sikhs, and in retaliation for that, 2 of her Sikh bodyguards assassinated her. In retaliation to that, in the streets of Delhi, 3,000 Sikhs were butchered in 3 days. And that's when I began to start to redirect my film work towards fighting the rise of religious fundamentalism. So in the next decade or so, I made 3 films on various aspects of the rise of religious fundamentalism. So the first one is in the Punjab, and here I found a group that was celebrating and reminding people of the legacy of Bhagat Singh. He's the guy in the middle there in the hat. Bhagat Singh was in the 1920s, he, along with his comrades, became part of the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army. And he, along with, when the British killed an Indian Congress leader, in retaliation, this group assassinated a British officer. And then Bhagat Singh was hanged for that in 1931 at the age of 23. He was maybe one of the first earliest socialists in India, and when he was sentenced to death, he wrote a little booklet called "Why I'm an Atheist." So, but in the Punjab of the 80s, Bhagat Singh's memory was being claimed by Sikh fundamentalists who said that he was you call us terrorists, but Bhagat Singh was a Sikh and he was a terrorist, so we are Bhagat Singh. The Indian government, on the other hand, was claiming Bhagat Singh's memory as a great patriot who helped to fight the British. But the left movement was the only one that remembered what he stood for in his own writings. So I followed a group of Hindus and Sikhs from the left that was traveling through Punjab, reminding people of what Bhagat Singh actually was.
ये फोटोग्राफ हिंदुस्तान समाजवादी रिपब्लिकन पार्टी
Could we increase the volume of the film a little bit, slightly? Yeah, so this film, In Memory of Friends, which you just saw a clip from, basically tries to has a kind of a left perspective, is looking at Bhagat Singh's ideas. And Bhagat Singh wrote back in the 1920s that class struggle would be the antidote to religious violence and religious sectarianism. And so the film explored, and so was this group trying to do exactly that. But by this time in India, the left movement, the class perspective was already weakening. I mean, their influence had weakened. And when I was making a film about the rise of Hindu fundamentalism, while the left was still an ally in the fight against fundamentalism, it was not an adequate ally, in the sense it could not actually stem the tide. And so I was also looking for other possibilities of fighting sectarian values. And I found two more, apart from the left, I found at this period that caste, the idea, as long as people became conscious of the fact that the Hindu revivalist upsurge was not authored by people from lower caste, and that people from lower caste were people who had been denied justice as Hindus in the Hindu fold. And that the leadership of these fundamentalist violent groups was always in the hands of the upper castes. So in this film, I'm exploring caste as well, and how caste relates to the changing ethos. And then I also found a priest in the temple mosque that was at the heart of this film. Was a fight between the Hindu fundamentalists who wanted to build a temple in the place of a mosque that already existed from the 16th century. But I found the actual priest of that temple to be a Hindu who interpreted his Hinduism in an inclusive way and was not in favor of creating animosity with the Muslims. And I think that by and large the majority in India would subscribe to that understanding of Hinduism, which is an inclusive understanding, where the Hindu God is actually not meant to be in any one stone or any one location. The Hindu God is supposed to be all pervasive. I mean, should be as much in the Muslim as in anybody else. So this idea of Hinduism as a broader category is also part of this film. Okay, so we'll just see.
If I may say something, in this excerpt, in this clip you showed us, there is for me also one of the lessons of your work and films. You are describing some of the items in the library of Bhagat Singh, and so there is as many as political thinkers than poets and novelists. And I think it's a key also for your work that you need both to be like a citizen of the world.
Yeah, I mean that was the amazing thing about Bhagat Singh. As I told you, he was executed at the age of 23, and you just look at what he's read. I mean, what he's quoting there. He's at the age of 23. He's an intellectual. He's wrote in English. He wrote in Hindi. I mean, in Punjabi, and he wrote in Urdu also. So he knew 3 or 4 languages at that time, and was in his notebooks scribbled all different scripts.
But also you read Rousseau.
And he's read world literature already at that time, from Mark Twain to Rousseau to Gandhi and Tagore. And he's not restricted by his own ideology. I mean, he crosses beyond his own ideological perspective. He's a budding Marxist, but Marxism is only one of the things that he likes.
And what did you read when you were 20?
I didn't read much. and actually, even in my films, you don't see a lot of reading. I am basically experiential in the sense my documentaries are observational as well as interventionist, but they're not very theoretical. I do my research while I'm making the film.
Of course, but I was asking about your youth. What did you read when you were a teenager?
I don't know if you want to know all that. I mean, I read P.G. Woodhouse, for instance. I mean, I read Fanon and I read many other things, but I did a lot of reading just for entertainment.
And did you went to the movies? Did you see films that inspired you, or not at all?
Again, not much. Probably not. I was not, and that's another thing when people ask about influences in filmmaking. And many times I come across films afterwards that were made in the same period that looked like they could have influenced my work, but in fact they're films that I saw later. So it's just something in the air that was making us make the same kind of films, or same structures, or same. Partly the equipment was similar. People who didn't have money and were against the system were using any means necessary. So even the ideas of imperfect cinema of Espinosa and things like that, I read about after I had already done a lot of imperfection.
Maybe Christophe has some observations to make?
I was just struck by indeed this universalistic character of Bhagat Singh, and indeed the fact that he was fluent in so many languages. You know, that is before communalism in India. Now nobody would claim that they know Urdu, and they would never, of course, they would never even learn Urdu. But at that time, Urdu was a language of all the religious groups. And what I find also...
It's not before communal, even at that time there were communal riots, and Bhagat Singh actually even comments on the communal situation. For instance, he talks about how the trade unions in Calcutta didn't allow the riots to go on. Hindus and Muslims fought the rioters together.
It was at a time when you had still elite groups within each community that could fight communalism. And even Lajpat Rai, who was the one who died, and in retaliation of which Bhagat Singh was an Urdu speaker, even he was a Hindu. And that's part of the past. You know, you will not find today Urdu
anybody knowing Urdu.
That's all.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Partition dealt a grievous blow to the Urdu language in India and to Hindustani in Pakistan. So as India and Pakistan became separate countries, and as the fundamentalists had greater and greater influence in both countries, they started to remove the commonality in the language even. So they started to emphasize in Pakistan the Arabic content and the, not even the Persian content, but the Arabic content, and in India the Sanskrit content, at the expense of the words that came from the Arabic. But even today, when I go to Pakistan and I speak the same language that I speak in India, Hindi, people understand everything I say, and I understand 90% of what they say. There are 10% Urdu words which I don't quite get, and partly because even the Hindi cinema has become the kind of glue that has created common language across India and flows into Pakistan, because Hindi movies are watched in Pakistan as well. Okay, so now we'll see a clip from In the Name of God. This was again the temple mosque controversy, where the Hindu fundamentalists identified a mosque and they said that our God was born at this very site and we're going to knock down this mosque and build a temple in its place.
C'est une œuvre qui est entièrement conçue du point de vue des exploités, des parties les plus faibles, les plus déshéritées d'une société, et elle s'est donnée pour fonction, pour tâche de décrire à la fois les origines et les enjeux des situations dont elle s'empare, donc celle des femmes, celle des intouchables entre guillemets, celle de certaines communautés stigmatisées. Et dans la plupart de ces films, Anand, avec parfois un très grand courage, s'efforce de recueillir la parole de toutes les parties en présence, mais sans jamais, évidemment, abandonner quoi que ce soit de son point de vue, de sa propre position, qui du coup analyse la situation avec une très grande clarté et donc une extraordinaire énergie à la fois d'activiste, mais aussi de pédagogue. Donc je remercie infiniment Anand en amont de cette séance, à la fois pour son œuvre magistrale et pour sa présence parmi nous. Pour nous aider à mieux comprendre et mettre en valeur et en contexte les enjeux des films d'Anand, nous allons bénéficier de l'expertise de Christophe Jaffrelot, donc qui est professeur, spécialiste de l'histoire de la vie du Sud, et que je remercie infiniment pour sa disponibilité. Christophe Jaffrelot est directeur de recherche au CNRS, enseignant à Sciences Po, mais il enseigne aussi sur sa vision de l'humanité, puisque au-delà évidemment des questions locales, ce que son œuvre évidemment nous décrit et nous transmet, ce sont aussi des comportements humains qui nous touchent d'où que nous les voyions. Je voudrais enfin signaler dans la salle la présence de Kwodo Eshun et de Angelica Sagar, donc de l'Autorite Group. Je ne les vois pas, où est-ce qu'ils sont? Ah si, ah oui. Et c'est très important pour nous puisqu'ils connaissent aussi bien l'œuvre d'Anand que la personne, Et donc, nous serons évidemment très attentifs et très heureux de recueillir à la fois leurs remarques, leurs commentaires et leurs compléments d'information sur cette œuvre qui leur importe et dont ils sont, je crois, de grands admirateurs. Donc, je laisse la parole à Anand, à moins que Christophe veuille introduire aussi son point de vue sur l'œuvre.
Two couple of words, because before you start, maybe I think appropriate. Just to say that for the social scientists working on India, the work of Anand Patwardhan is invaluable, and I was very pleased to see many of my students coming, and sometimes even from India, and discovering Anand's work in Paris, which is a real success. I think for two reasons, it's that invaluable. First,
Bonjour, bienvenue. Merci beaucoup de votre présence. On va pouvoir commencer donc cette masterclass consacrée à l'œuvre d'Anand Patwardhan. Je vais donc dire quelques mots à son sujet, au sujet de Christophe Jaffrelot, qui nous fait le plaisir d'être là. Anand Patwardhan, comme vous savez sans doute, est venu au monde la même année que la Constitution indienne. Et peut-être d'une certaine façon, son œuvre s'en trouve-t-elle comme traversée par le souffle de l'histoire collective. Et c'est une œuvre qui nous décrit une nation comme personne, à ma connaissance en tout cas, ne nous l'avait encore montré, c'est-à-dire observer du point de vue des conflits, des lignes de fracture, parfois falsificatrices, des situations les plus injustes, et parfois aussi les plus violentes, et dont les films d'Anand nous rappellent souvent ou nous aident à comprendre la profonde absurdité.
First of all, indeed, it's the direct access to the history of the last 30, 40 years. And secondly, first-hand material. For the social scientists that we are, sometimes you can't have access to these kind of sources. And I would say that this is a history of India that has the quality of mixing events and long-term trends. Events, the emergency, there is no book on the emergency. The film Anand made in 1978, just after the emergency, is a source of an event that is, of course, invaluable. And then trends, Dalit politics, Hindu fundamentalism, these are long-term trends that, unfortunately, for some of them, we can understand better with these documentaries. And even some trends, of course, mix. So Anand selects the events which are the best entry points into these trends. The Ayodhya movement, and you are immediately immersed in the internationalist movement. Two last quick words. This is a history from below. This is the history that is not written by people who cannot write their history, because sometimes they just don't know how to read and write. So we have their voice, and when a woman says the way she has been called Chamar.
Au King's College, à Preston, dans tous les endroits prestigieux du monde, et donc on a une chance tout à fait extraordinaire de l'avoir aujourd'hui avec nous à Paris. Alors je voudrais citer parmi ces innombrables publications 3 ouvrages. En 1998, La démocratie en Inde, sous-titré Religion, caste et politique. Le plus récent, dont le titre pourrait être aussi un commentaire du travail d'Anand, Inde, l'envers de la puissance, et sous-titré Inégalité et révolte, paru chez Fayard, presse du CNRS en 2012. Et puis il a publié aussi en anglais Religion, Caste and Politics in India, donc au Columbia University Press en 2010-2011. Donc pour cette masterclass, Anand a préparé une série d'extraits de ses films, organisés chronologiquement, et dont certains ne sont pas montrés au cours de cet hommage. Et donc pendant environ 1h, 1h30, il va nous les commenter en compagnie de Christophe. Vous pouvez bien sûr intervenir, si vous le souhaitez, au cours de ces commentaires. Et puis ensuite, nous disposerons donc enfin d'une grande plage de temps pour pouvoir échanger avec lui, lui poser toutes les questions que son œuvre soulève, à la fois sur l'Inde, sur son histoire, mais aussi sur ses choix cinématographiques